Welcome back, everyone. If you haven't checked out our previous episode, please go ahead and check it out. We would like to continue our conversation with Dr. Winkup, and we would like to start with the question: do you think social media would act as a reliable source of information for patients?
So that's a very, very tricky question. I think that's one of the questions that I often ask myself when I find that a patient says that they've been using social media. So in the previous discussion, we were saying all of the great things that you can get as a clinician and a researcher through social media. But I do think it's important to have a perspective of the other side. I mentioned briefly previously that sometimes people will use social media as a way of finding out about their illness. And I think there are many strengths to social media for patients. For example, it's a way of finding support. And we've done some research in this previously showing that support through social media and online forums for patients, in particular with rarer illnesses, is incredibly useful and can build quite strong support networks. Similarly, the social media accounts of many charities and patient organizations do give out lots of useful information, are regularly kept up to date and can be very helpful, in particular, for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic, where guidance was changing in the UK. There were different rules about whether people should be isolating at home, whether they should be having the vaccine earlier, boosters and things like this. And social media and patient charities were quite good at using this as a way of keeping people up to date in what was a situation that was changing frequently. But to answer your question, what are the risks and what do we need to know about? Well, social media is entirely, for the most part, unedited. People can say whatever they like. Therefore, it does happen. People can pass themselves off as experts and write whatever they want, and that may not be true. Now, thinking more broadly than rheumatology, I'm sure many people of the misinformation about vaccines and things, and social media unfortunately has allowed for certain voices to become stronger, and even if they're perhaps not being fully listened to by patients, it can cause doubt. And I think even as a clinician, when I read certain pieces of evidence, it can prompt me to think, is everything quite as it seems? So it is very, very difficult to negotiate in terms of finding out where misinformation is coming from, not being drawn in to think that misinformation is actually credible. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face, both patients, doctors and researchers, in terms of one of the limitations of social media.
In that case, how do you think we can prevent misinformation? What role do central agencies like the ACR, the ULAR, BSR, APLAR, PANLAR, all of these play?
Yeah, so it's very difficult, and it's something I've considered quite a lot. I've read many people say that if you are in a position of being either a researcher or a clinician, you should directly challenge false information. So there's kind of a question on an individual level of if we see something that is obviously fake, we should challenge that. But I think it's very easy to sit here and say, I'll challenge false information. However, I don't think I've ever done it in such a public forum as on social media. So it is very, very challenging. Although people are encouraged to challenge these things, the actual reality of doing it is very difficult. So I'm not going to sit here and say it's our job as doctors or researchers to challenge every piece of misinformation, because that comes with its own consequences. So on an individual level, we should try, if we're an expert, to point out where things are wrong. However, I understand why many people don't do that. And I myself must say, I've often read things that I believe are wrong and have been hesitant to comment on it. And I think that some of that is because it's such a public forum, because often, again, the example of vaccines, there is such a polarization of what different groups think, that you worry that you'll get very publicly dragged into a very heated debate. You may be getting a lot of unwanted attention and targeting and things like that. So it's very, very difficult on the individual level. If you feel confident enough to challenge these things, by all means do so, but be careful of what kind of response you're going to get. Social media does not, it's trying to tackle this. I'm not sure how well. So what I frequently will do is you can report posts as being false news and things like this. However, having done that for a few, clearly wrong vaccine misinformation things, the response from social media companies looking into this can often be incredibly frustrating, which does make things difficult. So at an individual level, there is something that can be done, albeit I'm far from the right person to be saying, that everyone should be doing this, because I myself do find it incredibly challenging and makes me quite nervous. On a larger or more institutional level, and you mentioned many different institutions in rheumatology, all I think pretty much have social media accounts. All are very good at spreading information quickly. So, for example, with the BSR, when there was guidance in the UK about what needed to be done for patients who were shielding from the pandemic at the very beginning, information was spread quite quickly through those routes. In terms of, so I think that's useful. I think it's very useful if you've got a genuine certified organization full of experts that can put out information that is correct and true at the time of it being sent, is very, very useful, and does sometimes kind of take away from the whole individual on individual conflict you may get if there's false information when it's coming from a larger organization made up of experts. Then I think that's incredibly helpful at trying to make sure that information is correct. I think more widely thinking about the internet, if we go slightly aside from social media, but just Googling anything, we have to be somewhat careful in that probably if you were to Google about rheumatological problems and up-to-date information, the first page of Google may be full of useful resources, but as you click further, as you go deeper, you're more likely to find things that people are just kind of saying in passing conversation, one-line things that then start popping up that may not be entirely true, and may also just be based on experience of one person. So that does make it slightly difficult. So as long as the main organizations can give out as best information as possible, that they can be at the top of the list, then that's very helpful. But we still have to appreciate that beyond that, there will be individuals sharing their own experiences, their own thoughts, and it's important to be able to differentiate between whether that is based in fact or whether that's something that may be less true. And that's where it gets slightly more difficult.
That actually makes sense, because then that's each to its own, right? So it's the physician's and the doctor's job when the patient comes to you with misinformation to point them in the right direction.
Absolutely.
How do you think physicians should deal with uncouth comments or misinformation on social media?
Yeah, so this is really tricky, and this is one of the things that always kind of stopped me from wanting to do much on social media in the past. So I have a Twitter account. It's probably my main form of social media that I use. For many, many years, I've had my Twitter account since I think I was at medical school. For many, many years, it was used for absolutely nothing at all. And then after going to a few conferences, I thought it might be useful for kind of engaging more professionally. And one of the things that I was concerned about was, you're out there on a platform, you're quite exposed. How do you deal with criticism and things like that? So, for example, I was nervous about kind of sharing research. Actually, there's a recent paper that we've written that that I've not yet shared on social media because it's on quite a controversial subject. and I'm slightly nervous that individual responses to the controversy may be directed more at me, whereas what we're trying to do is just show the findings of the study and an interesting outcome that was somewhat surprising. I don't want to be caught in a position where I'm having to defend something that may have been taken the wrong way. So even now, even using social media a lot, I think it is quite nerve-wracking that you have to think what you're going to post before you do it, because you don't want to upset people, and also think about the connotations of what you're trying to say from all angles. I think we can sometimes be suckered in to the point that if we're just interacting with other doctors or researchers, that we kind of set our language at the wrong level and forget that patients may follow us. I'm very easy to find on social media. It's, by design. And so therefore, I think it's important to consider who might be reading what you're posting. That's all well and good for suggestions. We have the General Medical Council here, who are our professional body in the UK to make sure doctors adhere to the right standards. They've given good social media advice on what you should and what you shouldn't be saying on a social media account. And I think it's really important that guidance is in place, because you need to remember who can see it, and that people will find you. So it's particularly tricky to make sure that you consider all of these correct things. And again, another thing that I think was somewhat tricky when I started using social media was how do you react if a patient you see in clinic follows you? And these are kind of questions that I still can't answer after all this time. But if one of your patients follows you on social media, if it's Twitter, do you follow them back? If it's Facebook, where it's kind of a friend request, do you accept the friend request? And it's that language that I think is slightly hampers things, and I've seen studies going the other way around, where patients have been added on social media by the doctor they've seen in clinic, which, again, it's not something that I would do, but it does raise kind of a discussion of where that appropriateness is. In the past, you would go and have your appointment, and then as the patient leaves the room, that's the end of that interaction. And so it does raise questions about where the boundary is. So I think whether patients follow you on social media, whether you answer questions on social media, again, is very tricky. If someone asks, who may not even be your patient, who may be a patient from somewhere else in the world, asks you a question on social media, it's very hard to decide how you answer that without going into generalisms. So if that happens, I think the important thing is to keep everything very generalized, make it very clear that you can't give advice on individual cases over social media when you're not the doctor caring for the patient. And again, I know of one lawsuit that has happened. I think it was in South Africa, where there was a woman had a young baby and wanted some advice on what to feed her baby. Tweeted a nutritionist who gave some advice, and then there was conflict about whether the advice was correct, whether that was a doctor-patient relationship or not, and things like that. So I believe in the end of that case, it was suggested that there was no wrongdoing, that there was no doctor-patient relationship because it happened on Twitter. But it is something that we need to be aware of. And I think in terms of what kind of the key message is for that interaction is if you set some ground rules for yourself when you start. So I think if you're new to social media, if you're thinking of setting up a social media account, keep relatively quiet until you're comfortable with how it works, how conversations go, see how other conversations work with other people, and then draw up some of your own rules. So if you're going to say to yourself, I will not follow any patients. Now that in itself may make a bit of an echo chamber because patients are important. Patients' voices are important. I think I mentioned previously. So you do need to have a personal way or set of rules for how you're going to deal with things. I personally follow a few people who are patients with rheumatic diseases, not patients who I directly treat, but it's very useful for me to get the other side of view from those patients on my Twitter account. I don't think I follow any patients who I have personally seen in clinic, but I think that some patients who I have seen may follow me. And I think keeping that at the front of your mind is always important before you post on social media. Think, how would this be perceived if you were the patient and that was your doctor and what they were saying? So I think that's a really important thing to consider. And I think is one of the things that I think makes most doctors hesitant about using social media.
Yes, I do agree. I think it's vital for doctors to understand that on social media, you hold a very responsible position because you're up for public scrutiny, which brings you automatically into a position of responsibility. I absolutely agree. Would you like to summarize our conversation and some last thoughts that you would like to part us with?
Yeah, sure. So I think social media, whether we like it or not, is something that is here. It's not going away. If you're a doctor and you don't use social media, that's absolutely fine. But I think you need to have an understanding of what social media is, because patients will use it, other people will use it. And I know that I've been to conferences where people have discussed great talks by people, and those people are not on social media, but there's been positive feedback. So I think you can't just say, I don't use it, it's not my problem. Your name is probably being mentioned on social media without you knowing it, and patients are using it as well. So I think you need to have an understanding of what social media is at a basic level, even if it's not something that you want to spend your free time doing, which I entirely understand. I think there's a lot of good benefits from social media. From a clinician point of view, I find it a really useful way to engage with other clinicians, stay up to date. I see lots of papers on social media that I would otherwise not be able to find. And that's a really great way of keeping up to date. From a research point of view, again, it's very helpful for keeping up to date and engaging with other collaborators. And I think it's useful for patients in terms of support and having that accessibility to have questions answered. Having said that, there are some things that are drawbacks. I'm not going to pretend that it's all absolutely perfect all of the time. That misinformation is very, very important in terms of misinformed content. So people just being told the wrong things entirely. Also, I think we need to have a degree of skepticism sometimes. People may present themselves as an expert. People may present themselves in social media very differently to how they are in real life. And I can think of a few cases where someone's social media persona is very different from what they're like when we meet them in person. So I think it is very important to have that understanding that you can't take absolutely everything at face value, because people use the platform for their own gains in a lot of ways, whether consciously or unconsciously. And most importantly, we need to make sure that if it's a use or a way of getting information for our patients, that we're doing our best to make sure that that information is absolutely correct and that they're accessing all of the right help and support that they need.
Thank you so much. I really, truly had a wonderful conversation with you. Thank you very much for your valuable time. And it was an absolute pleasure to host you. Thank you to the audience and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed our discussion as well, and I hope that this has been useful.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.